about 50 of his mounted men, and to obtain from Black Creek a number of horses. December 7th, arrangements were actively going on for the renewal of hostilities. 8. Governor Call transferred to General J. the command of the army today. Supplies continue to come in. The work at Volusia progresses rapidly. The army directed to be in readiness for the field. 9. Reported to the Secretary of War and the Adjutant General. Active preparations continued. Wrote to Governor Schley urging that a regiment previously required be sent to Florida to take the place of the Tennesseans. Wrote to Governor McDuffie of South Carolina required a battalion of 5 companies of drafted militia. Made arrangements for the transportation of the sick of the Tennessee Brigade from Volusia, via Savannah, to New Orleans. 10. Governor Call left us today the fort at Volusia named Fort Call. Major Gardner designated to command. Arrangements made for its defense. The army ordered to march at as early an hour as possible tomorrow. Arrangements made for the movement of the army. December 11th. Supplies which were expected last night not having arrived, the march of the army was necessarily put off until tomorrow. Captain Washington, commanding in the Creek Country, directed to join the army in Florida with 2 companies of the 4th Artillery. Major Dearborn, commanding in the lower part of Georgia, also directed to join. Captain Page ordered to take command in the Creek Country. Lieutenant Clark directed to organize an efficient wagon train to operate between Ferry and Fort Drane. Colonel Warren and Captain Smith to furnish escorts for the train. Lieutenant Bainbridge turned over to the quartermaster the horses on which his command was mounted. 12. Reported to the Secretary of War and to the Adjutant General. Major Forsyth Paymaster, ordered to Tampa Bay. Captain of the Ordnance Department, reported and ordered to furnish double-barreled guns and other ordnance supplies. The advance of the army moved today under General Armstrong. General Armistead with the regular troops and the Indian warriors left to secure the stores. The advance encamped about 8 miles from the St. John's. General J. The advance after dark with Alabama Mounted Volunteers, Tompkins Artillery, and Harris's Marines slept in General Armstrong's tent axes sent forward by General Armistead for the Tennesseans, to enable them to repair the road. December 13th. The advance moved slowly forward, repaired the road and bridges. The axes sent forward reported to the fort marched about 12 miles and encamped. The troops in the rear came up while we were taking up our ground. 14. Moved forward to the Ocklawaha, crossed the river with the advance and part of the baggage wagons and encamped about a mile from the river. Part of the train with a part of the force and the rear guard remained east of the Ocklawaha. The Floridians and Alabama volunteers drove in near 100 head of cattle. 15. Detached Lieutenant Colonel Caulfield to attack the Indian chief Asuci, or Cooper, and after crossing the remainder of the baggage wagons and troops over the Ocklawaha, marched forward, about 10 miles, and encamped for the night. Today an incident occurred which it was apprehended might lead to difficulty. An order had been given to the principal quartermasters not to permit pack horses to move in the road with the wagon train. A young Tennessean determined to disregard the order. He was admonished by the quartermaster but disregarded the admonition. The Q master reported the fact to General J in the presence of General Armstrong. General J informed General A that the individual must be punished. General A immediately took the matter in hand. The young gentleman apologized and General J expressed himself satisfied as he considered the discipline of the service had been maintained. Lieutenant Colonel Caulfield joined, having burned Cooper's village and taken 1 Negro prisoner, who was so aged that he was obliged to leave him. December 16th. Marched forward about 15 miles, found a few cattle, but discovered no sign of Indians encamped within 2 miles of the Fort King Road. 17. sent the Indians forward to reconnoiter, marched to Dade's battleground and encamped. The Indians examined the Wahoo Swamp. Not an Indian was found nor any recent signs discovered. All the trails led in a southeasterly direction. Reported to the Secretary of War and submitted several suggestions for his consideration. December 18th. Communicated with the Secretary of War. Sent in instructions to Colonel Henderson. Commenced stockade yesterday. It was completed today, or rather tonight. The report of the scouts who had scanned the cove, as well as other strongholds of the enemy on the Withlacoochee, left no doubt on the mind of General J of the enemy. Having left that river and gone south, long trails were discovered in that direction, in consequence of which it was determined to send the Tennesseans, whose terms of service had nearly expired, to Tampa Bay with the wagon train. December 19th. Communicated by express with General Reed at the mouth of Withlacoochee. Directed that the Tennesseans at that post should be sent to Tampa Bay, and required reports in relation to the quantity and condition of the supplies, and whether the enemy has been seen recently in the vicinity. The Tennesseans marched this afternoon under General Armstrong. The scouts returned tonight, having examined the country east as well as west of the road to Tampa, and reported the enemy in force about 8 miles east of the road in a large hammock near the Little Withlacoochee. Addressed a letter to General Armstrong directing him to send a part of his army to cooperate. The troops ordered to be in readiness to move tomorrow morning at daylight. December 20th. Put the troops in motion this morning and proceeded to the hammock in which the hostile Indians were represented to be last night. Searched the hammock for several miles, found recent signs and a large Indian encampment, but no Indians. Heard nothing of the Tennesseans. Returned to camp. 21. Placed General Armas in command of Fort Armstrong, the recently erected fort, and of the whole army north of the Withlacoochee. Set out for Fort Foster to examine that work, and to designate the site for a depot between it and Fort Armstrong. Encamped at night, about 7 miles south of Big Withlacoochee. Received an express from Colonel Henderson at this camp, informing of the arrival of Commodore Dallas, and his wish to cooperate with the army. Also General Gaines having ordered the 6th Regiment. December 22nd. Proceeded to Fort Foster, examined the work, and then continued to Tampa to confer with Commodore Dallas. Arrived at Tampa after dark. Found General Armstrong here with his brigade. 23. In consequence of information from the lower counties of Georgia, countermanded the order to Major Dearborn to join the army with his command. Communicated with the Secretary of War. Commodore Dallas visited General J. and in the most liberal and patriotic manner offered the cooperation of the naval force under his command in any manner in which General J might think proper to use it. December 24th. Wrote to Major Cross, answered a letter of the President dated the 5th of November, wrote to Commodore Dallas, wrote to Echo Harjo requiring him with 100 of his warriors to come to Tampa Bay. Wrote to General Gibson on the subject of an increase in the allowance of sugar and coffee to the troops. 25. Wrote to General Armistead and directed that the bridge over Big Withlacoochee be completed immediately as well as the work to defend it. Wrote to Lieutenant Colonel Foster on the subject of the bridge and fort at Withlacoochee. 26. Visited Commodore Dallas and conferred with him amount and disposition of the force to be furnished by the Navy. 27. Wrote to the Adjutant General on the subject of the term of service of the Washington City Volunteers, also in relation to alleged depredations on the plantation of the Honorable Forsyth. Made arrangements for relieving the garrison at Fort Clinch and removing the to Tampa Bay. Instructed Major Wilborn at Fort Clinch as to his duties and to hold his armies in readiness for immediate service in the field. December 28th. wrote to Commodore Dallas on the subject of a garrison for Fort Foster and also for Fort Brooke. Ordered a board to examine the broken-down horses and report upon them. 29. Wrote to Captain Mills on the subject of the steamboats American and Dade and thanking him for his kind offer to have his other boat fortified and manned. Wrote to Commodore Dallas on the subject of exploring the Withlacoochee, a letter to Governor Call on the defenses of the territory generally, and requiring 4 companies of regular militia to defend of part of the peninsula. Wrote to Major Cross in relation to means of transportation. 30. Wrote to General Reed on the defense of the territory. Wrote to Major Brant requesting him to employ 50 wagon drivers and as many pack horsemen. Wrote to Lieutenant Colonel Foster informing him of recruits having been ordered on for his regiment, and that blacksmiths would be sent to him. Sent to the Adjutant General an application from Major McIntosh for a furlough. Wrote to General Reed rec dispatches from General Armistead reporting that the Wahoo Swamp and the Cove of the Withlacoochee had been thoroughly searched without finding an Indian or a recent sign of one. Deck 31st wrote to Commodore Dallas and requested that a vessel might be ordered to cruise off the mouth of the Withlacoochee for the purpose of ordering the 6th wreck to Tampa Bay. Informed him of a trail leading to the Gulf towards Crystal River. Janey 1. Instructions sent to the commanding officer of the 6th in fee. Directed slendered horses to be shot. Instructed Lieutenant Colonel Miller as Commandant of Fort Brooke, temporarily, reported to the Adjutant General. 2. Directed Major McClintock to turn over the command of Fort Foster to Lieutenant Leeb of the Navy. Directed Lieutenant Carey directed to keep on hand abundant supply of subsistence. Lieutenant Mackenzie directed to keep constantly on hand an abundant supply of arms and ordnance stores. Wrote to Captain Chase, President of the Pensacola Railroad, on the subject of Major Graham. Directed Captain to keep on hand a large supply of forage, and to transport to the interior depots the supplies ordered. Also, to take proper care of the horses in order that they may be recruited as soon as possible. Also, to issue materials to the naval officers to build boats. Directed Colonel Henderson to release all prisoners except one who had attempted the life of another. Ordered that rations should not be offered to able-bodied men who should refuse to work. Every arrangement being made for the troops to take the field. Orders were issued that they move tomorrow. Order of march in 3 columns in extended order of encampment as nearly in a square as possible of battle in single rank. And extended order and in 2 lines when practicable. January 3rd. Marched from Fort Brooke. General J. with Lieutenant Colonel Caulfield's battalion of mounted Alabamians and Major Nelson's battalion of mounted Georgians, preceded by the way of intending to come into the Fort King Road near the Withlacoochee, marched about 25 miles and encamped near a fine pond. 4. Moved forward the guide, not acquainted with the country, mistook his way and brought the command into Fort Foster. Here Colonel Henderson joined with the main body and the train. 5. Moved forward and encamped about 4 miles south of Fort Dade on the Withlacoochee. 6. Arrived at Fort Dade and encamped. Transportation ordered to be selected by the Q Master for the Army in the field, and the remaining of wagons to be sent to Tampa Bay, escorted by 1 company of regular troops. And the Florida Volunteers. Wagoners directed to be armed. Florida Volunteers to be. Janey, 7. Communicated with Lieutenant Colonel Miller and Major Thompson on the subject of the question between them on the subject of brevet rank. Wrecked a report that Major Childs was on his way with recruits' ordnance stores. 8. Directed General Armistead to detach 50 regular troops and 100 Indian warriors to meet Major Childs. Also ordered Major Nelson to proceed and join him. organized the Army of the South into two brigades, the first under General Armistead and the second under Colonel Henderson. Directed that Major Morris should examine the hammock where our Indian scouts had discovered Indian signs. 9. Directed the quartermaster at Black Creek to double the supplies at Volusia. Troops arriving from the north directed to Volusia. Lieutenant Colonel Crane ordered to take port at Black Creek, or at one of the posts on the St. Johns. General J moved to Fort Armstrong. Colonel Henderson ordered to Fort Armstrong. Lieutenant Colonel Foster directed to remain at Fort Dade and to complete the work. Ration of corn in the field reduced and horses ordered to be grazed. January 10th. Received advice of Lieutenant Colonel Fanning being expected with 2 companies of artillery, ordered to take them to Volusia. The South Carolina Battalion to be mustered into the service of the United States, and 1 company sent to Volusia. The surveyors to be employed on the line from Black Creek to Fort Drane. Q Master at Black Creek directed to push on supplies to Fort Drane. 4 companies of South Carolina militia, subject to the order of Lieutenant Colonel Crane. 16 Negro prisoners were at the Panasofka Swamp, reported to the adjutant. General ordered Major Nelson to join Lieutenant Colonel Foster at Fort Dade, and directed the lieutenant call to proceed with his whole force down the south side of the Withlacoochee. 36 additional prisoners taken in the swamp, 1 Indian wounded, Powell barely escaped. 10. Marched with 500 troops under Colonel Henderson in camp near Panasofkee Swamp. Saw no fresh signs of hostile Indians. Came up with the Alabama Volunteers and Indians, moved down to a point near the cove, encamped, and reported to the Adjutant General. 12. General J employed in examining the swamps and hammocks returned to camp. 13. Moved forward to a position near Camp Izard. Obtained a number of cattle. The Indians and part of the mounted men sent down through the swamp and hammocks on the Withlacoochee met them at the encampment. Spent the 14th and the 15th in scouring the swamps, and on the 15th General J with the mounted men went to Fort Clinch, crossed the river supplied by the Blue Spring. At the Indian encampment took 60 or 70 head of cattle. Came across a fresh Indian trail, followed it to the road to Fort Drane, where it disappeared. Met Lieutenant Colonel Foster at Fort Clinch, was informed of the capture of a Seminole Indian, who gave information of the position of a number of Indians near Homosassa. 16. Ordered Lieutenant Colonel Foster to proceed and attack the Tallahassees and to take the Seminole prisoner with him. Jim Boy with his warriors ordered to join Major Nelson, ordered to accompany Lieutenant Colonel Faust. Returned to Camp Izard by the way of the Blue Spring. Returned to Camp Izard by the way of the Blue Spring, examined the trail which had been discovered yesterday. Found where the Indians, who had disappeared on approaching the road, had came together northwest of the road. The trail went off in a northwest direction towards the Wakasasa Swamp. Came to camp late in the evening. Ordered Captain Wright to Camp Izard, and the mounted men to bring up as much forage as they could carry. January 17th. Reported to the Adjutant General, marched towards Fort Armstrong. Marched about 10 miles and halted in the hope that Captain Washington would join. He did not come up. 18. Marched forward and encamped near the cove of the Withlacoochee. Captain Washington joined here at 3 o'clock a.m. 19. Left Colonel Henderson to take on the infantry and other regular troops with the baggage train, and proceed through the swamps with the Janie 22nd. General J put the army in march towards the head of the Ocklawaha. Marched about 12 miles, part of the route over extremely bad road, and encamped for the night. Compelled to open the road on the whole route. 23. detached Lieutenant Colonel Caulfield to attack Philip and his Negro force on the Apopka Lake, with his battalion and Harris's Marines LT. Chambers sent with him. Moved the army forward, marched 16 miles, found a note from Lieutenant Chambers encamped for the night. 24th. Moved forward past a part of the Thalauhaki River of mountains, had an extensive and beautiful view of the country including the lake. Met Lieutenant Colonel Caulfield, who had succeeded in surprising Cooper and killed him and 3 of the warriors, and took 9 Indian and 8 Negro prisoners. Moved forward and encamped near a small hammock with a fine stream of clear water running through it. Major Graham made a bridge over the stream. Here 3 hostile Indians were discovered, and they were tracked on a trail for some distance. January 25. Moved forward, took the trail and proceeded 7 or 8 miles to an old Indian village, countermarched, and sent out to examine the several trails. 26th. Marched across the country on a trail on which cattle had been driven, the woods had been burnt, and the Indians had evidently crossed in considerable numbers. Marched about 16 miles and encamped on a beautiful lake. It rained during the night. Ration of bread and bacon reduced. 27. Marched forward, the cattle tracks increased, and several droves were driven in. Marched about 6 miles, greater part of the way through prairies. The Indians brought in several droves of cattle. Passed a trail where there were recent pony tracks and numerous Indian tracks. Came to the Thalauhaki, examined the ford, crossed over, found it practicable for wagons and artillery. Detached Colonel Henderson with Lieutenant Colonel Caulfield's and Harris's mounted men, and Morris's Indian warriors to make a reconnaissance of the country in advance. Sent out Captain Delaney on a trail to the left, into a swamp and hammock. Colonel Henderson reported the capture of 100 head of cattle and that recent Indian signs had been observed, though they were not numerous. General J. crossed over the Thalauhaki and directed the colonel to leave a small detachment to secure the cattle and to move forward in the direction of a smoke that was burned in advance. Colonel Henderson not reporting as soon as General J. expected. He directed Captain Lurrell to take an escort of mounted men, and follow on the trail on which the colonel had moved, and to report without delay. Philip McCoy of Philadelphia, who had enlisted into the army under the name of Madison, and who acted as mounted orderly to General J, accompanied Captain Lurrell. The enemy was found and promptly attacked by Colonel Henderson. Cirque Madison was dispatched with a message to General J, but was unfortunately killed on the way. A second express was sent, and an Indian runner came in about